Hello, viewers. Hello, listeners. Once again, I warmly welcome you to my dear Literature Made Simple. And today in class, we are going to discuss, as you can see on the screen, Redemption Road by Elma. Trust me, if you haven't read this book or you haven't listened to my class on this book, you should do because it's super interesting, super educative, traumatic, sad. It's everything that you can mention. So it's a study of war, trauma, and redemption. Redemption here is just like the English word, a kind of freedom. And basically, it's about the Liberian War. If you know about Charles Taylor and the Liberian War, then you'll be able to understand this book. Even if you don't know, you can still understand it, but sometimes relating with it would be a little bit difficult, but trust me, I'll do whatever I have to do to make it simple and interesting to you. Now, I have a little message about the author. She is a Liberian and she wrote quite a number. So her contribution to African literature through powerful storytelling of conflict and recovery and helps readers understand the Liberian Civil War experience through personal narratives. Then this is a kind of introduction. Sorry, it's not showing so well on your screens. It's a kind of introduction. So we have the novel it tells the story of a woman who survived the horrors of war and fights for justice whilst trying to heal emotionally. Through Bendu's journey, the author shows that recovery after conflict is difficult but possible when people confront the truth and work toward forgiveness and reconciliation. So basically, this is an overview of it. So the main or the prominent character is Bendu, and who was so traumatized due to her experience or experiences during the war, but at the same time went all out just to help people recover. And this makes it very interesting because she was going through what they were going through, but she tried to help them to recover. And by attempting or by helping them recover, teaching them how to face the truth, how to forgive another, she learns herself and was able to forgive herself. Now, today, I will be discussing with you chapter by chapter analysis. And due to the length of the book, part one, I'll put this in parts. So, part one will be on chapter 1 to chapter 5, hopefully. I'll try to make it a little bit simple. Then, or chapter 1 to chapter 4, it depends. So every chapter, I have a short summary that you can read on the screen to give you an idea. But I will do a discussion of it. So basically, let's zoom in straight forward. The chapter one can be captioned as memory, going down the memory lane, having rituals because there's a funeral. Then people came for the funeral, so collective trauma. So we can talk about memory, rituals, and collective trauma. Now let's look. So the novel actually begins with the funeral or the memorial ceremony of Catherine May Lewis. Now Catherine May Lewis was the grandmother of the main character Bendu Lewis. Now Catherine disappeared during the war, the Liberian Civil War, and her body was never discovered. It was never found. But the family decided that there was a need to organize a funeral in her honor or in her memory. So the funeral service was organized and they had to use an empty coffin instead of the body because the body was not recovered. So they used an empty coffin and there were some personal items that belonged to Catherine that were placed in the coffin. We have things like family photograph, her clothes, a Bible, and other meaningful belongings. Now, This funeral attracted a lot of people. A lot of people were invited and a lot of people attended the funeral. Relatives, neighbors, community members. Now, this is symbolic because it represented or it represents collective nature of mourning in Liberia according to Redemption Road, but I think in most parts of the world, funerals are collective. It's a collective responsibility. Even though biblically it said that let the dead bury their dead, societal responsibilities demand that in most communities, when someone loses a beloved one and decides to organize a funeral or a memorial service, people get invited or they get invited and they attend. Now, what makes it very interesting is that sometimes people even attend without being invited. So, collectively, people mourn together or collectively people mourn. And this was symbolized by the quantum or the number of people that came for the funeral. Now, as the people gathered to pay their respect to Catherine, the atmosphere, it's a solemn ceremony. So the atmosphere was filled with both sorrow and reflection. Sorrow because there's a loved one that was dead and whose body wasn't even found. Reflection because it sent people back to memory lane. The main character Bendu herself has to do a flashback. It sent people back into memory lane of what actually went on and the repercussions or the pains that people went through as a result of the war. So now also know that the absence of the body also highlights the uncertainty that certain families or many families experienced during the war. They lost a lot of things that they could not get back or they could not lay their hands on. Their beloved ones vanished during the war. Now, through conversations among mourners and some emotional tones of the ceremony, we gain the readers or we. I usually prefer to say we instead of readers because I am part of the readers or we are part of the readers. So the readers they begin to understand how difficult, how dangerous, how dilapidating war can be, and how these wars affect us, specifically civil war, affect the lives of ordinary citizens. Because for many of the families that were gathered there, the war left behind unanswered questions and unresolved grief. They lost people they could not trace. They have questions some could not. Later on, when we keep discussing it, we'll get to the point where I'll talk to you about a lady that had questions. People were writing letters. Then do ask them to write letters to their loved ones. And people wrote letters that showed how they had an answer questions. They were seeking questions they were seeking answers for. So the funeral, therefore, it becomes not only a tribute to Catherine, but also a moment for the community to remember the broader suffering caused by the Civil War. Now, although we didn't know much about Bendu, the focus, the protagonist of this story, we are yet to be introduced fully to her. The ceremony helps us to organize her connection to families that has endured the devastating consequences of the war. Later, you get to know that she became a war counselor. So the connection that she has to the people has been established by this ceremony. So you should know that. Then another thing that you should also note is that the ceremony or the scene it also introduced us to the emotional landscape of post-war Liberia. How the war was over, things seem normal, but things aren't normal or aren't normal because people were still going through the effects of this war. Some carry the pain in their hearts and the rest. Now let's look at some symbolic interpretations from this chapter. So the empty coffin has a meaning. A coffin without a body talks about many victims whose deaths were never properly acknowledged. One or two reasons could be that they were not found, there were no surviving family members, or family members do not have the emotional maturity or strength to acknowledge or remember them in the ceremonial way like the Hindu's family did. Now, this empty coffin also represents uncertainty experienced by families who lost relatives during the war. They were not sure of what to do. They were not sure, like I told you earlier, they had questions that they needed answers for, questions that were begging for answers. Now, let's look at the historical context. So, by beginning with funeral, Elma Shaw is the novelist here. So, what Shaw did was to introduce us to the theme of loss and also situate the narrative within a community that is trying to recover from war, that is surviving after war, post-war trauma, and the rest. Now, the presence of a lot of people from the community also demonstrates collectivity that I mentioned. And this is not only in Liberia or Emil Shaw's novel Redemption Road. I think Africa is a very common phenomenon in Africa, some parts of Asia, and I know Europe too, because I've watched quite a number of movies where people get invited. The practice or the practices might differ. The approach or approaches might differ, but people still get invited. So, as a way of summarizing or concluding on chapter 1 for you, chapter 1 introduces us to very important things, collective grief and remembrance. We also have the lasting impact of war. The war will come and go, but the impact will stay with the survivors for a very long time. Then community solidarity, collectivity, communal living. So you realize that the opening chapter actually sets the ball rolling, or it sets the ground ready for a very interesting journey. Chapter 2, you have on your screen, Bendu's work at the trauma center is described. She helps people who were abused or displaced during the war. So that's the summary of chapter 2. Now, chapter 2 begins the quest for justice and the burden of leadership. Now, the narrative shifts from Bendu's family or the general to another very important government official, Moses Vani. And Moses Vani worked with the Liberian political and legal system, a politician and a lawyer or in the legal system. Now, Vani earlier in the chapter traveled to the Temple of Justice. I'll give you a little more about the Temple of Justice later. But there's a temple called Temple of Justice that is situated in a community that lacks justice. That is great irony. Now, the Temple of Justice is the highest court of the land, of the nation of Liberia, according to the novel. And traveling through the city exposes him to harsh realities that many citizens, many indigents still face in this post-war environment. Now, he actually noticed a group of or groups of impoverished street children, street people, don't eat well, don't feed well, looks malnutrited, lacks a lot of nutrients, and they were begging on the street, and that's what most street children do, and performing small tasks for passerbys. If you have ever seen or been a street child before, a street person before, you understand this place better. Trying to survive on the street isn't a human's job. It's not an easy thing. Sometimes they do a lot of things just to survive. Now, these children are part of the generation that grew up during the war, and they were displaced from their homes. Some were separated from their beloved families. Some were raised in orphanages and the rest. And they had no one, nowhere to go to, so they decided to live and survive on the street. Now, the presence of these children is served as a constant reminder of the conflict's social consequences. So, chapter 1 ended with a reminder that there is trauma after war. Chapter 2 is also really reminding, and now chapter 2 is not reminding the ordinary citizens like chapter 1 did. Chapter 2 is reminding a politician and a member of the legal system that the war might be gone, might be over, the civil war, but the social consequence still lives with them. Now, Vanny, he briefly interacted with the boys and he acknowledged their greetings and also appreciated the difficult situations that they found themselves in or the difficult circumstances that they found themselves in. Now, his reaction reveals both his sympathy and helplessness. He wants to help them or he sympathizes with them, but is unable to take them from the street. Now, don't forget, he is an important person in the country. He holds a very prestigious political position in the country. But he knows and he appreciates that the problems that these children are going through isn't something that you can just resolve easily. Being a politician doesn't mean that you can just take them off the street. And that's one thing that I believe a lot of people do not understand. Politicians, some might be nosy, some might be lazy, some might be greedy, but sometimes the problems in society are so grandiose that they cannot just solve it in a flicker, in a twinkle of an eye. No, it's not so easily done like that. If it is, or if it were, there will not be any problems on the street. So he continued towards the courthouse, the temple of justice. And on his way, he reflects on his own life. And this is where there's a twist. This sends him back to memory lane and brings back the memories. He remembers losing his parents equally, but just that his were lost or his parents died through a gastric or tragic accident when he was very young. But the good thing for him is that that loss didn't demoralize him, but it rather encouraged him and shaped him to be determined to achieve his dreams, and now he's successful. Now, his personal history also allows him to be able to empathize with those who are vulnerable or those who have suffered in society. His might not be as a result of the war, but pain is pain. Some pains might be deeper and more frustrating than others, but pain is pain. So it helps him to relate with them better. As people say, when you vote someone who has stepped in your shoes into power, you stand a chance that he will understand your problems better. Now, when he finally arrived in the Temple of Justice, the huge building that symbolizes the country's attempt to rebuild the legal system, the legal institutions after the chaos of the war. But that building suggests that achieving the genuine justice in society, recovering from, is far more complicated than simply restoring the court. You could restore the legal system, you could restore the court system, but achieving like legitimacy, achieving justice isn't an easy feat. Now, let's look at some few things that you can read from the chapter 2. We have the contrast between power and poverty. So, Vani is powerful, he is rich, he is successful, and the three children. And so, bringing those two together actually brings about the social inequalities that exist even after the war has ended. Social inequalities do exist in a lot of communities, not only post-war communities, I believe, but it is more devastating in post-war community. That's one thing I want you to note. Now, the Temple of Justice is a symbol, it's symbolic. I told I'll tell you a little bit about it later. It's symbolic. So it represents hope of accountability, hope for fairness, hope for the future. But the surrounding social problems that surrounds where the temple of justice is situated suggest that justice alone cannot solve the deeper problems in society. Justice alone cannot heal the deeper wounds of society. A lot needed to be done beyond seeking justice to be able to protect the rest. Now, there has been some foreshadowing. Foreshadow as a literary concept basically means that sometimes characters are introduced to us and they foretell what is likely to happen in the future. They foreshadows the future. And that is what some of these characters show. So Vani, his empathy towards the children foreshadows his potential role of addressing issues of justice and reconciliation that we'll encounter later in the narrative. So he saw their pain, and that tells you, if you are a critical reader, that he might be doing something in the future to help these children. Now you could encounter some some issues or themes like social inequalities, Vanny and the children, the three children, responsibility of leadership. So leaders have a lot to do to be able to bring out Liberia from the post-war and the challenges of rebuilding institutions. Some of the challenges are so vast, but it's possible. And this brings us to the end of chapter 2. Because I don't want each class to be too long, I'll end chapter 2 here. And this is the end of part 1. So look out for part 2, part 3, part 4, part 5 in that order. See you in part 2. Bye-bye.